Hey everyone. So this is a conversation between Rachel, Hayden, and I, and how this conversation came about was she was a participant in my Dialogos course that just wrapped up a few weeks ago, and at the beginning of each of these sessions, we would have participants check in with something they might be bringing in to the space from the outside, sort of an idea is to name it, to tame it. And I remember on more than one occasion, Rachel bringing in some energy that she had, some aliveness around culture war and trans issues. And I remember being really interested and curious about her perspective and digging into more of what was there for her. And unfortunately, just because of the way that the course plays out, there wasn't an opportunity to explore it the way that we do explore it here in our conversation. So when the course was finished, I reached out to Rachel to see if she wanted to have that conversation, and she said yes, and this is that resulting conversation. One thing that I would say about it is that I don't think this is in any way a comprehensive conversation. I think we do a pretty good job of surveying the landscape from our vantage points of how we're relating to these various issues. And I think there's some room for us to zoom in and to look a little bit more closely at some of the terrain, which she's agreed to do. So I'm looking forward to having those future conversations with her. Okay, so I don't even quite know how to sort of title our conversation, but Rachel, I can even though this is sort of our first conversation, there's like I have some sort of affinities for you. You occur to me as like a friend, even though we don't quite have what might be traditionally that sort of thing. But there's I guess there's an intimacy that's been shared through through the calls that we have done through the course and stuff like that. Sort of get a sense of you and things that I like about you that's really like felt really drawn to, like, oh, there's somebody I can have that conversation with and not get yeah, there's a lot of I don't know about like seeing myself, but there's a lot of alignment that I sort of perceive. So it's been really great to watch that sort of unfold through our previous times together, and then just get more and more excited about us having a conversation like this. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. Generally, that sort of, I think the way that I came into this was like, hey, you seem like you might be, agitated or wrestling with sort of the social justice sort of activist maybe end, more specifically around trans issues. And although I imagine we can probably find parallels into other cultural issues as well.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And there's just something about, I remember watching your first talk with John Vervaeke, who I think we both consider a friend. And I remember listening to that and just sort of like feeling like a real yes, like, oh, like, yes, like this person really knows, like has like and of course it's all bias confirming, but there's just something that I so love. It's like, yes, I want to hear more of that out there. I want to hear more of that out there. Um, so yeah, before I sort of turn it over to you to say whatever it is that you might want to sort of say as sort of a bit of an intro, I'm really hoping in this conversation that we can sort of see on things that we agree on, although I don't think we're going to get too deep into detail, but we might. We'll see what kind of time we have. And then also, I want us to sort of look at where we might be deceiving ourselves in our preferences and our biases, and then what you and I might not agree on, and what we might not be getting about each other and sort of our perspective. So I just get, to me, that's a conversation. And I'm so sort of tired of looking out there and seeing people say, I want to have a conversation, and it's just in one direction. It seems to fit a political line or a particular thesis antithesis position. And that might unfold here because of the perceived alignment. But I'm hoping that we can bring more nuance and sort of good faith exploration, and certainly an internal lens to sort of see how we're showing up in the conversation.
Oh, that all sounds great. Yeah,
Nice.
very much like I feel like, I've been trying to figure out like what to do with identity, what to do with, the weird political situation going on. And I feel like ever more like, yeah, we need to have the conversation and it needs to be a real one, you know, and what a real conversation is still something I'm trying to figure out in a lot of ways, you know, like it's a lot of what you were saying, like you're talking about your agreements, your disagreements, but like, you know, looking at perspectives and multi-perspective understanding and how we can get to that rather than say like, oh yeah, we're having a conversation and it was really great and we agreed, or I had a really great conversation where I just gave my party line to someone and yelled at them about how stupid they were and that was awesome, or you know what I mean, any of the stuff that you're familiar with out there, we're all familiar with. I've done it, I've done all that, you know, I'm recovering whatever, not really SJW, but something along those lines in a sense, you know.
Mhm.
So I just, yeah, I'm really open to it. I'm excited about, they have this big question mark around our whole conversation today that it's like, feels like a really good, like we need, it's like exploration that we need to do.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think part of the thing that's here for me is sort of being aware of my own reactivity as I sort of see various opinions or positions sort of projected and asserted, you know, online or, you know, in culture, and sort of aware of the ways in which it doesn't really land, or like even beyond content. Often for me, I have such a focus on behavior,
Mm.
and there's also that difficult thing of watching somebody in a particular behavior and being careful not to dismiss their content just because they're in a particular activated state. It's like, that doesn't necessarily make them wrong. It might make them an asshole, but it doesn't necessarily make them wrong. And I actually find sort of that process in some ways a bit exhausting. Like it
Mm.
requires a lot. I find it requires a lot of attention, effort, introspection, of like sorting, like, nope, nope, that's about me. Is this about what they said?
Mhm.
Is that, you know, sort of seeing nodding, is that sort of a bit
Yeah.
of your experience as you try to disseminate?
I mean, just like, yeah, can I swear on this thing? I can swear on
Yeah,
this.
totally, totally.
Yeah, it's just this fucking like on this social media, just like sitting there and just fucking thinking about something someone said for like 2 days and like, you know, just these, and maybe it was an offhand comment or something, but like
Mhm.
just going over it, like what are my biases here, am I tone policing, am I, you know, should I be like, is their tone so bad that it's not it's indicative of like non-good faith argumentation, or you know what I mean, or
Mhm.
what's the hidden agenda, what's my hidden agenda, where's my shadow in this, and yeah, just like, yeah, like when every conversation has to be that, you know, I'm just like, I need more self-awareness just to even get there, obviously more self-honesty, more, you know, all that to even start. And it does feel like it's exciting, it's insurmountable in some ways, it feels like, you know, and but also like I feel like the thing that you brought up in the authentic relating workshop that I took was you know, just like starting to touch more on shadow issues, and I feel like that, of all the stuff I just said, like it's really starting to draw me more, where it's like a scary thing that I used to kind of like put in the shadow itself, but like, you know, it's now it's more like, oh, but you have like, it's just so unavoidable at this point.
Yeah, and I wonder if you would agree, of the potential that that amount of sort of effort and energy that's sort of required to engage, or like, or to work with your reactivity rather than just stay staunchly in your reactivity that I'm right and then you can just let it go and everybody else is an idiot. I wonder also to what degree that makes what's the word? It's like you end up, it makes it more relevant, if to, you know, sort of use John's terminology. It starts to make it more relevant because we start to internalize and use, like almost use all this energy towards something. It starts to grow and become important because we've put so much focus and attention, not necessarily even on the content, but just the process of disseminating the content, and the argumentation, and then observing ourselves and how we turn around and, you know, am I responding in good faith, you know, this exchange of ideas. Like that's sort of my guess, is a part of it is just like, this is really exhausting. I feel like I'm fighting, you know, some sort of cold war, like, you know, culture war.
Mhm.
um, and and I think I get more and more frustrated when I watch other people engage and do the warring part, and I'm not really participating, but I'm reacting to it. And I'm just like, you know, I want to like throw the fingers up to both of them and just say like, I'm done with this, you know, like there's something important here, but it's so exhausting. It's so exhausting. Um, yeah, I just wonder if that sort of lines up, you know, sort of looking at that polarity of, um, sticking to your reactivity, and how that serves somebody, because they don't have to put all this energy. They can just
Yeah,
stay in their righteous self.
for
And then
sure.
this other part where, I imagine we're sort of like truth seekers or want to get a right grip on reality, and how exhausting it can be to try to do that, just in terms of, beyond our regular lives of like working a job or being a parent or, whatever that is.
God, yeah, it's hard enough already looking at, okay, you got Ukraine, all these other issues out there that are also putting, taking mental energy and emotional, especially for me, energy. And sometimes I think we got to let ourselves slip a little bit, and just be like, we got to like bring
Mhm.
out the fingers, because
Mhm.
we have to let each other do that to some extent,
Mhm.
and that's part of it. You can get stuck back into analysis about how much you should do that and everything, which is,
Sure.
that's also valid.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
like, I don't know, I was kind of listening to the Dark Renaissance critique of the Game B video that was over on the Stoa
Mhm.
like a month or so ago, and
Mhm.
something about that was really interesting. It was like Bard was talking about like staying in the argument, and like we can't come to a premature synthesis
Yeah.
on things, but like the willingness to stay in it, even though you might get hurt, even though you're gonna slip and you're gonna fuck up and you're gonna sound like an idiot, and there's a chance that 10 years later someone's gonna dredge that comment up from Twitter and use it against you when you're a totally different person. And
Yeah.
I think that overhanging fear is a lot of what we're talking about with some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, how do we navigate that? How do we, like, I think part of my excitement of us having this conversation is like, I see sometimes some of the things that we might talk about, you're not allowed to talk about, because it creates an automatic response to like even explore that, is to suggest dot dot dot,
Yeah. Oh my
anti-trans
God.
or
Yeah.
racist or whatever that particular
No.
thing is. How do we end up having a conversation, an honest conversation, with all knowing all that? And we've observed enough of it. We've observed enough of people being ganged up on, of being doxxed because they don't hold a view that people agree with. How do you actually engage? Like, I mean, you have to, I'm not trying to pat ourselves on the back, but there has to be a certain degree of bravery to sort of put yourself out there and weather the storm to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's totally it. Like you kind of got to be like, well, someone's gonna maybe use my comments. I was on Greg Enriquez's podcast a little while ago, and we were talking about gender, and we tried to lay out a real you know theoretical framework based on Greg's ideas on, and we tried to apply it to gender, and I think it went really well. And then this friend of mine like messaged me and was like, yeah, it kind of sounds like you're like you're a trans medicalist, which is a term for people. I'm sure most people don't know this term, but it's like you're not really trans unless you've gone through surgeries and
Mhm.
hormones, and like everyone else's identity is invalid and blah blah blah. Like it's a big fight in the trans community, right? There's a very specific little subcultural war.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Where did that come from? Like that's not at all what I was trying to get across. And it became clear, we talked about it in good faith, and it was like that it was the terminology was unfamiliar to this person, and they filtered it through a certain like more culture warsy terminology. And and like not even their fault, not even their fault. That's the problem, is like if we hadn't been friends, it could have just gone, it could have just, they could have told someone else that, and they could have told someone else that, and they never would have watched the original podcast. And you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's a little microcosm of what you're talking about, I think.
Yep.
Like, and like why that stuff is starting to become so difficult, because our fundamental languages, our cognitive cultural grammar is so different.
Yeah, totally.
Like a big starting point is getting a language in common somehow.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's like, how are we actually going to do that? There's I love the idea. It sounds like an ideal. And yeah, we continue to observe how language is subverted, or particular words are redefined, not
Yeah.
even like literally in the dictionary, but also culturally. I guess one sort of feeds into the other. Once it culturally changes, it tends to change in the dictionary. But there's sort of that frustration that I've often had with certain terms. And it's just like, this is what this thing means, and you're referring, the equivocation, right? But we're
Yeah.
actually using the same word rather than like two separate ideas and equivocating those. And I think I would agree. I think that's a really big catalyst for the problem, because I use a word and I make, which I think is a reasonable assumption, that I'm using the word correctly, and we're all going to think that, and that you hear it and interpret it the same way because I'm using a word, right? I mean, one probably of the obvious ones is going to be racist,
Yeah.
like, or racism, and yet we're certainly seeing how the way the term is being used is sort of being manipulated to meet a particular point. It's almost like a post-truth thing. It's like, well, racism is this, and here's how I can draw the lines. And meanwhile, a lot of people in culture are like, but I grew up understanding racism is this, and now you want to like
Yeah.
use the same word to describe a thing that I know differently. It's like, why can't we create a new word for it, you know?
Yeah,
um
like for instance, like, okay, yes, you got your like, Bob Marley's philosophy that one race is superior and another inferior, right? That was kind
mhm.
of my classic definition of racism. And then it's like, oh, well, you can't be racist if you're not white, because, that's a whole different definition, because you're adhering to the structural, identity of like the history of Western civilization and blah, blah, blah. And, and that, the valid critique within that, yeah, it needs to be disseminated. It needs to be kind of teased apart from like, like Kendrick Lamar's album last week, I was listening to it a ton, and he's just like, there's this line like, oh yeah, I might be racist, and it's like, well, okay, if you're using, now that's the classic definition again,
Right.
and I mean, I think it's a fantastic fucking album. It's like really refreshing to hear these kind of just off the cuff things, because it's like it's getting to like it's like kind of confusing things more, to the point where it's like clarifying things in terms of all the equivocation that's happening, like
Right. Right.
deliberately, like in a really clever way. And that's like one solution probably, like an artistic solution to it. But then there's
Mhm.
also like the painstaking process of like sounding like a pedant because you're going over definitions repeatedly in a conversation, and you're like, you know,
Yeah.
like, I mean, sometimes it's good. I think it shows respect for that person's views if you can do it in a way that's like open questions about what do you mean by that
Sure.
word, and like let's make sure we're on the same page and stuff. But again, yeah, it's a lot of energy.
And that takes a certain kind of person that's used to having dialogue in a certain way, sort of has some handle on their reactivity, such that they can actually ask that question, whereas general public might have a harder difficult time with that, and that creates the amplification of things that I think sort of lead to a culture war. Like, I don't imagine people like yourself or myself, or people who we know and spend time with, um, if that was the consciousness that was common, that we would end up in what we see as this particular culture war like this. I just don't think generally good faith people interested in sort of the truth. I think a number of people interested in sort of a synthesis. Like, it's important to take into consideration lived experience, because that is a subjective, real and valid thing for the individual, but we also exist as a collective outside, and we can't always interact with each other always as an individual, because in terms of the time and understanding, it's like combinatorially explosive. It's just like, I just can't do it. It's just otherwise that's all our full-time job would be trying to understand each other and get shared reality, and sometimes we have to take shortcuts, and it seems to lead into these particular problems.
Oh
But
yeah, yeah.
sort of going back about the language, it's just like, okay, so what is trans then? Because I'll use this small statistic, and the thing is like, so in Canada they just did a census, and the census revealed that 0.33%, so that means 1 in 300 people identify with a gender that's different than the one they were born with.
Mhm.
So they used that particular term. They did not use the word trans, because I imagine that would also include non-binary people, and I would tend
Sure.
to consider that non-binary is not trans. But then there's self-identification, and
Mhm.
then there's clinical, gender dysphoria diagnosis, and maybe some others that I'm not familiar with. So it's just like, we put this all under this one umbrella of trans, and for me, there's some perspective or lived experience where I'm like, well, that makes sense. Of course, the transition, like, great. And then there's these other ones where it's like, uh and then it's just sort of, but we call it the same thing, and it's just like,
Yeah.
well, no, I'm kind of like, this makes sense to me. this over here doesn't. Unfortunately, they're both fitting under the same umbrella. How do we navigate that?
Can we pick this one up as our case study or case example for a bit?
Yeah.
Like would be the examples that like, okay, this doesn't make sense in that umbrella, like for you?
Well, it's tricky, right? When you start looking at particular, and of course, this is in some ways cherry picked, but we see particular incidences that start to suggest like, oh, this might be a different, I don't want to say mental condition, different perspective
Mhm.
of identity or the cause of a different issue, where it's easier for me to say the ones that make sense. Like I know somebody who's trans, and before they transitioned, they dreamt that they were a woman, like
Yeah.
persistently. And for me, it's like, okay, there's something about that starts to make sense in terms of what I understand it. It's very minimal of gender dysphoria. It's just
Sure.
like, okay, there's something there that really should be looked at. But
Yeah.
if I take into consideration, so yeah, there's ones that seem like really obvious to me to make a particular transition, others that don't. And then for me, I've certainly got a question about how does one reconcile, I feel like a woman, but that they don't go through reassignment surgery beyond, the scary implications of a medical procedure that I completely understand. But I don't imagine that's the case in most of those instances for people who haven't fully transitioned. So there's like these gradients, that almost creates a spectrum.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, oh, but we put all of this under that same umbrella.
Uh-huh.
And that seems like a problem to me.
Yeah, and you got, yeah. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot there to pick up on for me, definitely. Like I do peer support in the, within the mental health system. And a lot of the kids that I support are going through identity issues. And a lot of the times when I start working with them, they're just, this is my identity, this way, this way, this way, very black and white. And then interestingly, they've been a lot of times starting to question what that is. Like they start off and they're non-binary and asexual, so or whatever, and then they like, well, maybe I'm just traumatized, like maybe I can't relate to my gender and my sexuality, like they, and these are like teens that are actually thinking this now. So somehow that's gotten into the, that whatever TikTok culture to some degree. And again, like, I don't know the truth of all of it, how many people or whatever, I gotta say that for the public, but like I think, yeah, there's a lot of times people jump to conclusions and conflate things that just need more time and more space to work out. And like, yeah, like sometimes you got this kid who is like an obvious case since they were little, and then by the time they're a teenager, you have like 10 years of evidence showing that they've like always kind of consistently been this way, and other times it takes longer. But like, are the people who, and then this is where like, some of the people in the sense making scene have a point about this, like you don't just say you're this thing and then you're that thing.
Yeah.
It's like, it's really hard for people to swallow that's just suddenly like a thing now, is that you just project whatever you decided that you are out into the world, and if you don't do anything about it, does that mean you are that thing? If you don't, what I mean, if you don't ever, you got a male body, you never shave and you never do anything different with your life, and you want to use these pronouns, like it's very confusing for people, obviously, and I think it's riding on I think to take this issue, and like the epistemology of what someone's gender is and figuring that out and what do you do about it, like I think we're missing ontology there. I think we're missing gender. Like we don't know what gender is, and we probably never really did. My guess, like I know we could say we don't know what it is anymore, everything's crazy and going, shit's going haywire, and there's no truth anymore. But also like I don't think we ever really did know. We had it kind of a simplistic pre-modern version maybe that we've carried into this post whatever age.
That's fair, because when you say that, it sort of occurs to me, and I've certainly had this experience of people sort of conflating, if you use the term masculine or use the term feminine, and you're sort of talking about like a set of behaviors, people tend to, at least in my experience, equivocate that to male female. where I actually see them as very different things, even though there's a huge correlation in terms of, most people of a particular sex will, exhibit these particular traits, at least when left alone. And of course, there's outliers. So I certainly, this idea of gender being, I guess, a spectrum, different than biological sex. I can sort of accept some part of that. And then generally where I start to get a bit crunchy is where people make sort of assumptions, have entitlements and expectations that like, well, you're presenting as a woman to me based on my understanding. And if I refer to you this way and then you get upset because you're not feeling seen, it's just like,
Yeah,
really? Like, and even just being crunchy around that idea, like, again, it goes back to that exhaustion of like, I just want to be in the world,
yeah,
and I'm happy to be with you or whoever that individual is. But this idea where if identity is such a big deal in their life,
yeah,
that it creates this immediate reactivity, going to sort of John's idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion. It's
yeah,
like already they're holding some part of like white male, like limited, heteronormative, and it's just
yeah.
like, and like now you don't see me, now you're just sort of in your activity from your learned ideology and stuff like that. So I went a little off the rails there, but
No,
um
it makes sense though. It all comes up. It's coming in hot, right? This stuff is all, and it's being taught in college campuses that like, if you see like a woman across the parking lot, right? And then you're like, oh, she's over there. You've just harassed that person because it's the same as, you potentially misgendered them. And it's the same as deliberately using someone's name. Like I've literally heard that stuff, and I'm trans, I'm like, okay, like this is going way too far though. Like, the reactivity, and and it's being supported by people who I think a lot of times are well-intentioned, who want to like kind of counteract like the abuse we've suffered in the past, and they're going to do it by just this absolutism.
Yes. Okay. So I like hearing you say that, because I think that's a perspective that I've sort of held. I've seen it, I've held it more harshly, I suppose, in terms of racism, anti-racism, but I can still see that fitting into trans, I can still see that fitting into, I'll use this term, even though we tend to use it wrong, but feminism. And it's sort of this idea of like, the blowback. It's like, everybody who's not is experiencing the blowback. But for me, it's just like, to me, I see it as like, that's anger. And people are looking for a place to put their misplaced anger. They're holding on to it, and it's like, there you are, there's a place that I can do it. And I've been bolstered by my, my identity group, or whatever the group is, to turn around and validate that particular behavior. And so I can just get away with just projecting anger everywhere onto things that don't line up with how I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So good faith. It's the hermeneutics of suspicion. There's,
Yeah.
and it's just like, is that okay? Like, I guess the question is, I imagine I know what your answer is, but I want to ask it anyways. It's like, is that blowback okay? Is that pushback because of the historical suffering, we'll call it, of a particular group? Is it actually fair to be so angry at people at this particular time,
Yeah.
in culture?
Yeah. It's such a good question. And it's like, I guess, what scares me about it is like the kind of dogmatic absolutism, and the like, what they call thought terminating cliches. If you say the word, heteronormative or something, it's like casting a spell with that word, and
Yep.
it can tend to just shut people down in fear, and I think there's just so much more behind. I mean, the anger, I think, is really like what you're drawing attention to is important. Like anger and grief, I would say, just like how we
Mm.
failed, as a culture in the past, and how we've, like all the stuff that's happened to Black people and to like queer people or whatever in the past, like I don't think we like John Vervaeke's influence has been pretty heavy on me, and he said something about talking about the need to grieve,
Mm.
like the death of God, for instance. And then it just kind of, I think him and Jordan Hall were talking about just the need to grieve in general. was such a huge thing that we're not getting to. And, you know, and if someone hasn't grieved properly in their life ever, like you can't really trust that person, you know. And I was like, oh yeah, like I feel like some of the anger and grief that's just not processed and it's just being projected. And sometimes it's self-project. It's like I am no longer pure, and it's getting mixed up with this like pseudo-religious thing of like, you know, I'm not pure enough, please, you know, I used the wrong term, and I need to go to the, you know, confessional or something to,
some form of repentance.
yeah, to repent from that. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
publicly, you know, accept my shaming and my repentance and stuff. And like all of that, that's like, this is like the big nebulous ball of wax around that anger and grief,
Mm-hmm.
makes it really hard to say for me that that's okay. Like on one level, I could be like, yeah, you know, shit happens and there's blowback and one group gets, you know, oppressed and then another one does. And that's kind of life. And to an extent, I don't like it,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I also like it's not really fair. It doesn't, you know, it's taking justice and elevating it above every other virtue, you know,
Yeah.
and I think that's wise. I think it's imbalanced, and it scares the shit out of me, to be honest. And that's why I was gradually coming to this point of like removing myself from a lot of the conversations about gender and sexuality and stuff, because it's freaking me out, you know, and I'm trying to engage with people like you in a more thoroughgoing manner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think you got a lot of like the people I've met in the sense making scene are not like are really good people, are really just genuine, you know, and I can see how me of 3 years ago or something might have been like totally mistrustful, you know, and just,
Right.
you know, like how different I am right now. So that's kind of a long answer, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's what was I going to say about that? Uh, I like you mentioning grief because I don't think I've ever quite I've gone that layer down. I just see the anger. Um, but there's something about when you name that, it just sort of landed as right. It's like, yeah, right. There is grief. So it was very easy for me to sort of look at the anger and and then turn around and cast and just say like, you're behaving the same as the group that you are angry with.
yeah.
So then I'm like, two wrongs don't make a right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
However, why one group is angry, they're both angry generally on one side thesis and this, they're both angry. However, it's interesting, I imagine on the trans and certainly on, at least on, African American, Black racism, at least in the United States, not to say that doesn't exist in Canada, but in terms of more of their history,
Mhm.
yeah, I imagine grief is a pretty big part of what that anger is protecting.
Yeah.
And that helps me connect a little bit more to the idea or the general frame of the other person, rather than just seeing that external sort of anger and just saying like you're behaving poorly.
Mhm.
And it's like that doesn't take it away.
So
You're still creating an impact on other people. You're still in reactivity, or maybe in process of working with your stuff, or maybe not, just purely in your reactivity because it feels good to turn around and do that. And there's never ending group of people that you can be angry with, and you can constantly blow that steam off and never actually work on yourself. um, but there's something about that I like. It's like, yeah, how do we actually how do we help trans people? Although I do sort of wonder, and I wonder about your perspective in terms of trans. um and I don't know particularly your history, and that's okay, I don't need to, but I wonder, people transitioning today, similar maybe to LGBT issues, people, the degree of the social acceptance. Yes, there are still the outliers, but what perceives to me is like a real openness and an acceptance, at the very worst a lot of tolerance.
mhm.
Not that I think the tolerance is a great thing, but I'll take it over resistance and pushing
Yeah.
back,
Right.
compared to, say, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago.
Yeah.
I can imagine there's a generation of trans people who have a lot of grieving still to do.
Mhm.
Maybe they're actually able to move some of it and seeing I wonder if this would make sense to you, seeing the strides in terms of trans, I don't know, acceptance is maybe the right word, term. I
Yeah.
wonder if they're able to move some of that, but I wonder about the grief or the flavor of the grief. And you know, you could speak to yourself, or at least what you've heard, you know, in the circles.
Yeah.
What is that flavor of that grief that somebody today, in say the last 5 years or something, would be transitioning? I wonder if you have a sense of that.
You know, for me personally, I'll try to like see what I can come up with for other people that I've, you know, put together. But there's a grief of just losing the time, like
Mm-hmm.
40 years of time not knowing who I was on a deep level, always feeling off, like I didn't quite fit, all the opportunity, like my life has taken off in the last few years, you know, like in a lot of ways. Like I just feel like I'm just so much more effective as a person. And I, you know what I mean? Like that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And that grief of like, well, I'll never be that person, a young person like that. I'll never get to be a beautiful woman. I'll never get to, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing where it's like, um, and you see that I think, you know, you'll see a lot of, oh boy, should I say this? Like, as you see a lot of like middle-aged trans women kind of acting out in adolescence of sorts.
Sure.
You know, like mini skirts and fishnets and just, you know, and like whatever, go to town, you know, and like I'm not here to age shame anybody, but you know, like I think there's a lot of that just needing to catch up and like live the life that you felt like you should have lived the whole time, you know. And then for me, I've just been processing that, like this, like grieving and also grieving the person I was before to an extent. Like I'm not like, you know, oh, that wasn't me, that's all fake and now I'm real or anything. But like that was a person who was scared as shit, you know, to come up to this transition and did it anyway. So I, you know, thank him, you know, for what he was, and I mourn his loss in a way too. And you know, like there's this all kind of internal stuff, right? It's like not as cultural for me. Um, but yeah, the culture, I guess the culture that didn't allow me to know myself in that way, you know, that was kind of the part that was like anger, grief, first anger, and then like more understanding, then grief of what I lost in that process, you know. And then, you know, kind of an acceptance internally of like, well, you know, life ain't fair, you know, like everyone's got their cross to bear, so to speak. Everyone, you know, like we're not ever going to get to this perfect plateau where the mountains are totally leveled, you know, and we're gonna have like no one's ever gonna be offended or looked down upon or something. And coming to terms with that was important for me too. And to say it's not cis people's fault that I have to pay a shitload of money to get the hair ripped out of my face on a weekly basis, you know, like it's nobody's fault that that's happening.
Right.
You know, I don't just get to yell at people for that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I feel really touched. Like, thanks because I'm sort of making some connection to the flavor of what that grief would be like. And certainly that idea of sort of lost time, I can actually think I can relate a bit to it on an identity side. I don't think it's remotely as what would be the word, not impactful, but like intense or full, as I imagine your experience has been. But I've certainly, you know, when exploring, you know, masculine and feminine and sort of that as polarities and the way that works into relationship, whether it's intimate relationship or not. I've certainly, you know, sort of told the story of not really feeling like I had an identity as a male.
Yeah.
And based on what I was seeing was, I believe, or at least I lay a lot of that at the feet of culture, because of when I was growing up, and we're still seeing a little bit of it, but for the most part, nobody is paying too much attention to men, especially white men.
Mhm.
But when I was certainly growing up, you know, the general narrative, you know, that was being implicitly fed was there's something wrong with men.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I
Like,
don't think I ever internalized it in a conscious way, but there was a way in which it was like, why would I identify with something that, you know, in my belonging, you know, socialized mind state, why would I want to identify with something that seems to be looked down upon? So
yeah.
there's a way in which I held it, I guess, unconsciously at bay. And I was aware that I was male. But I was also aware, you know, when I would play video games and you could pick a character, I almost always picked women, female characters. I always noticed it tend to be more of like a personal champion. It felt safer for me to play a character that was a strong woman
Mm, mm,
than I couldn't identify with the quote unquote strong man. Like if it was a military or shooting game, I couldn't identify with the male
uh,
infantryman. I would more identify, like it felt safer to go with the female part. So
oh,
how that sort of played out in my life, you know, with my first marriage and stuff is, you know, I don't think there was a lot of polarity because there was a way in which I wasn't really welcoming in anything about being a man. I was just me. And in many ways, that sounds fantastic. And in other ways, it meant I was just completely blind to certain biological things that seemed to
mm,
make me me. And I've noticed, you know, my early days of authentic relating, you know, this framing of masculine and feminine was coming in. And I remember my initial reaction, because I was bringing on all the social programming and ideology, was just like, this is ridiculous. This is so toxic. Why are you guys, you know, separating people in this particular way? Because I was doing the conflation and everything else. So
mm,
there's a way in which I didn't really like it, like feminine energy and masculine. And there was just something about it that just seemed wrong to the way that I was brought up in society and culture. However, over time and spending a lot of time being with people and just opening myself up and being open to new ideas and really looking in, doing a lot of inner work, there was a way in which it's like, oh, okay, I can see me being fluid in terms of I can embody a lot of feminine traits or traditional traits. But I also notice I tend to have a preference more on the masculine side. There's a way in which, yes, I had certain behaviors that suggested without a doubt I was masculine, but I wasn't holding them. So there was just a way in which I wasn't really living
yeah,
fully
yeah. Oh,
some part of me because it seemed like it was, even if it wasn't actively looked down on, it was not, it also wasn't celebrated. It also, I
yeah.
wasn't being told it was okay. If anything, it was just like, oh, it sounds like that's not okay. Like it wasn't okay for me to own my sexuality. Like, no, that's too aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
And then just allowing myself to be more this way, um, I think has freed me in many ways. So I wouldn't necessarily so much say I have a grief, but there's certainly those moments where I think back to like, if I knew then, or if I was the person then that I was now, how might my life have been different? Because it's this perspective that I wasn't fully living me. And I'm hearing some, you know, or at least I'm drawing some parallels to sort of your experience.
Yeah, this is beautiful for me for many reasons. First of all, just like on a human level, hearing your story and just like it makes me just feel so like soft and warm. Like, oh my gosh, like it's amazing. And it's also like a testament. I knew you talked a little bit with John about like, you know, how you came into authentic relating more angry and more, you know, bitter,
Mhm.
sort of. I think that's kind of paraphrasing, but you know,
Totally, yeah.
I could see this being part of that. Does that make sense? Or
I don't know that I ever drew the connection to that. But there was certainly the way in which I externally looked and sort of blamed for everything that was wrong in my life was because person A, person B, and person C weren't doing the things that made my life better. So I can see that sort of maybe being there, but I never had the connection. You know, there was just no connection until, you know, the first moment I even thought about anything like this was we were doing, and just as a heads up, this is not a normal thing. This is not an official event or anything else, but somebody in the community said like, oh, I want to do a naked tea group. So, you know, you've done tea group. So we did this and it was a small group. It was three guys and three women, basically three couples to a degree.
Mhm.
And it was interesting that the other two men, when they were naked, there was a way in which they started relating to what it was to be a man. And it
Whoa.
was very different than my experience. Like I was not having that at all. But to hear them and to notice the contrast within myself, I'm like, I don't have this perspective. Nobody ever told me be a man. Like even
Uh,
my father never did that. There were things that he wanted from me, but he never connected it to my gender.
mm-hmm.
And I wonder to what degree that might be connected to his brother, my uncle, being homosexual and his experience of drawing those sorts of labels. It could just be a coincidence too. But I know those two loved each other very much, and they were very close as kids. So I imagine my father saw a fair bit of, discrimination and stuff with him. So I imagine it had him further compassionate with people figuring out who they are. But it was just so interesting. Like, oh, I felt so privileged that nobody ever like said that to me. Nobody ever told me like, Taylor, be a man. And yet, as I thought more and more about it, I'm like, right. And it also meant I have no identity
Well,
in this realm either.
yeah.
Even though, I wouldn't say, is asexual the right term? Sort of, no, what's the right term?
Agender, maybe you want to use? I don't know.
I guess, yeah.
I don't know, genderless or something, or I don't know.
Yeah, but even then, I was fully aware that I was male. Like it made sense to me that I was male, but I didn't know what it meant to feel male. I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah. So this like this the other reason I was excited about what you were saying is it ties into my like they're theorizing so much that we don't have a good ontology for gender and we cannot have aspirational gender identity without a good understanding of what gender is, like, or at least, something that works for society. So there's like something like ontonormativity or something that we need, like, okay, what is it, what should it be, like, and those two should tie together for me. And like, and then then you've got the, bring down the white men thing too on top of that, that obviously complicates things. But like, I feel like a lot of us somehow want, I mean, I know I wanted an aspirational gender identity. Like I wanted, like, and that is what kind of drove me to like, what is a woman? What is gender? Like, how do I aspire to become a better person using the vehicle of gender, and I think women have their own issues with that. Like a lot of my like women friends like feel, it seem like they have their sense of gender sort of amputated from them as well in different ways. Like if you ask them what gender is, it's only like they know a lot about gender, but they know it as a series of problems in their life. Like as soon as you say, how do you relate to your gender, it's like, well, gender sucks because I didn't get this job, and gender sucks because I'm expected to do that or whatever.
Yeah.
And men are just like, I don't know, like,
because it's
like,
taken for granted, I suppose. Although I wonder if a lot of the people that you've been interacting with are sort of the same generation, like I'm Gen X. So I wonder if they also have a similar experience where it was just not a thing.
Yeah. And like for men, it's like less, there's less of the social justice critique a lot of the time that factors into that. But then it's like completely left out. And then it's like, now you're just like some Homer Simpson character, or something, like some dumb guy who can't aspire, and he needs just a man cave to play in and have toys. And, it's like, what's that? Like, that's not growing up as a man, it's like,
Yeah.
I feel like that's what you're given though. And I actually, since transition, I've like really become sympathetic towards men. Like, just like, I just love men. I love like, the potential there that's just different. And like, I love the difference, and I love the like, and I feel really sorrowful and sympathetic like about what you're talking about, like the lack of a, because if you say be a man, then that's like offensive or something in itself to people. I'd love to see like a more, what is, having the be a man thing and also having the like be a gay person or be a queer, like I want all that to exist somehow, but we can't do it without a fundamental understanding of gender, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, what comes up for me is sort of that idea that, and I imagine there's some nuance to what you were just saying. But the initial reaction is like, I don't want to be anything. The labels drive me nuts. I think that's actually part of my general anger, but then it's also part of like the expectation of navigating, going back to this idea of navigating using the term trans and then having such a spectrum of what falls under that particular category. And you've got people, with lots, this is a similar issue that I have in terms of the racism thing, is when we turn around and take a particular group and we just project onto them maybe the worst suffering we can imagine. And there's all sorts of people within that didn't have that experience, or they've moved on from it, or they processed it and they don't want to be looked at from that perspective, having the
Yeah.
group, some sort of group identity projected onto them, like we lose the individual.
Yeah.
So there's that part, where I imagine there's something really important of looking at, I guess, a better definition of gender. But there's also a part of where I want to just do away with all the labels. And I get we start to run into particular issues where the label or the categorization is necessary. I use the current obvious one is in sport. I mean, I think the solution to that is you just get rid of those categories and you find a different way to categorize people based
Yeah.
on some degree of,
Hormones or something.
yeah, well, exactly, right. But that's not what we have right now. What we have right now is a binary gendered sport, and then we have people who even just pushing, right, that idea of what is a woman, or what is a man.
Yep.
And then we end up with the self-identification part. And so like it seems like there are areas where it's critically important for us to function in terms of a society. I guess, I mean, some part of me wants to just dismiss all that and just say,
Get rid
like,
of
do we
it.
actually really need to figure that out? Can we just not play a different game? Can we just not, like, I don't think of you, Rachel, as, my transgender friend. And yet you're somebody that I feel like I can have this conversation with because you have some lived experience. But the thing is I don't expect you to speak for all. It's like, I know your experience is different than another transgender person that I have in my life, where they're not interested in talking about any of this. They just want to live their life. They don't want to get caught up in the activism and the identity part. They've just sort of like, this is me, this is who I am. I'm so glad I did this thing. And they're carrying on with their lives. So
Yeah. Totally. I mean, I know there's a philosophy professor, Sophie something, I think maybe it's Caldwell, that could be totally wrong, but she's talking to Agnes Callard on YouTube, and Agnes Callard is one of my favorite philosophers. But she's trans, and she's like, it's just like moving to Scotland. I just preferred to move to Scotland. I preferred to be a woman. That's it, done. No she didn't speak to aspiration or anything, and her view is very different from mine, on the surface at least. And I take that seriously. And it's also like, I'm glad you spoke to that, actually, because it's like there are people who just do not want a gender. They don't care. It's not of interest to them. And I speak more to the people who have that sense of wanting gender as something positive to aspire within, as well as like societies seem to generally need it over time and space. Like there's always, like, even though gender systems like are so different from each other, like there's like 3 to 5 genders in some societies, and they don't match up with anything that we would know as trans or gay or anything.
Sure.
In a lot of cases, like it seems there's always something called gender. It seems like I'm not an anthropologist. Maybe there are some like completely, like, people talk about modern Scandinavia as maybe like getting closer to there, but like where there's no gender. And I think it ties in, I mean, neurobiologically, we have like gendered parts of our brain that are pretty, they're not like huge, and I don't want to overstate it, but they're there, and maybe they were more important prehistorically. Like maybe like the division of labor meant that we had to have, what I mean? Like these major differences in our culture. And now it doesn't mean much anymore, but some of us have a really strong sense that we need gender nonetheless. That's like a holdover partly, or something like, but yeah, I like want to keep it loose enough that people who don't, I have like some autistic friends, for instance, who just do not seem to gender, is how I put it. They just don't really want any part of it. Either, and that seems to be kind of a trait associated with some autistic people, but also people in general who like don't want to make a big deal out of it. And I just hear John in the back of my head, like, cognitively there's massive overlap between the genders. It's like at most 5% difference, and it's like super, let's not like make this the fundamental difference between people, like a lot of people seem to want, and I think people want that because they want something, they want an identity to aspire within, and they want, what I mean? They want kind of the intelligibility and the security of that on the social level as well. But like, yeah, like how I would love, like, that's why I'm trying to like make as big a box as possible.
Hmm.
I don't know how that fits into what you were saying, but
Well, I mean, it takes me a little bit closer to your interest in sort of answering this question, or at least defining this thing about gender. And, you know, you mentioned the autism thing, and that draws a link to me that, you know, first I want to acknowledge studies that at least I've went through or read, you know, in terms of most cultural war issues, quite frankly, but in terms of trans studies, you know, either the numbers are really small or, you know, sort of questionable. Like there's not a lot of, I mean, maybe there is, maybe you know differently, but I imagine like a lot of things, there isn't a ton of money, you know, being put into it, such that there's, you know, exceptionally great, you know, gold standard sort of studies. And to understand that a disproportionate number of people who have ASD, who are on the spectrum, transition somewhere close to around 8%, where they're only about 1.5%, 2% of the population, and people that have it. So that starts to sort of maybe lead me into this question. And again, it may not apply to you. I'm not looking for you to defend your choice, but in terms of the general idea, it's like you said, or well, like I heard you say, you know, they just kind of don't identify, like they just don't have a gender. And then I wonder about like the social contagion aspect in terms of, you know, like I said, the statistic in Canada, 1 in 300 identify as a different gender than they were born with, or sex that they were born with. And that's a really small number. And the bullhorn on activism and trans issues is huge. I think it's disproportionately huge. And then, you know, we also see general statistics that, you know, again, disproportionately impacts young girls, that they're making the transition more than young boys are. And, you know, I don't know if you and I would agree, but to me, it's like, girls are more interested, you know, boys are interested in things generally, I got to make some assumptions. And girls are more interested in people. So they have a more socialized, grip on reality. You know, like their frame in their friend group or in society is a bit stronger than boys's are. So yeah, I wonder in terms of, and how that maps onto, you know, somebody with ASD. And that's not that I expect you to be you know, an expert or have the right answer for this, but I just wonder, like, sort of thinking off the cuff, or maybe you already have an answer for this, just sort of how do we sort of reconcile these things around gender of disproportionate there? Let's assume that it's a reasonably accurate number and it is disproportionate, just for the argumentation's sake.
sure, yeah.
How do we sort of, you know, how does that change how we collectively look at transitioning,
Yeah, yeah.
identity, self-identity?
Totally, yeah. And I feel like this is where we need to widen the lens again in a different way, because it's like our identity also comes from the, you know, social level of our existence, you know, in a wide variety of ways. But gender, I think, because it's very tightly knit, like our social constructs around gender are speaking to us directly, and they're coming right out of us, right out of our brains, you know, and our minds that emerge from our brains. So there's a very tight loop there. And so we have to think, I mean, I've come to think, I guess, I don't know that we have to, but that like who we are, you know, in terms of gender also is going to be influenced by the social dynamics that we face, like the pressures that society faces, that it needs certain genders for, perhaps, you know. And this is so muddy. I'm going to try to be careful enough, but that like the number of genders and the types of genders is going to change based on the needs of society to an extent. It's going to change the mindsets of people, and then who decides that they don't fit into the given boxes currently could change as a result of that. So they're like not just an emergence, but an emanation down in terms of gender that would incorporate everything from like, you know, the cultural level of like Greg Enriquez's theory. I don't know if you've studied that much, but kind of the self-justification that goes into that, and like, you know, use of language and stuff that like has enormously powerful effects on us, even if it's a construct such as money that doesn't intimately relate to our neurology, you know, like and so I'm, you know, I have no answers. Like I just don't, but like it's like it seems like we might be making the mistake of too narrowly focusing, even if we come from a neurobiological perspective and we say like, oh, okay, all these autistic people have something going on in their brains that like is changing their relational self, and then therefore they're often agender or transgender or something,
Mhm.
you know, like there's that. But then like, I don't think that we can talk about gender as a medical, purely, you know, bioscientific, whatever viewpoint, you know, without taking like cross-cultural studies and, you know, all that stuff into consideration as well.
Mhm.
That makes it extremely complicated, like furiously difficult for me to answer. You can see why, right? Like why I
Totally.
can't even answer that question very adequately.
Yeah. I mean, I think I appreciate that, because I think the answer is just it's complicated, and it's like what, you know, we can look at things from a regressive or a narrow perspective and maybe come up with a yes no sort of answer in that particular frame of reference, but the thing is that's one individual amongst, you know, or one particular instance amongst, you know, a world of different experiences, of different, you know, of how we sort of got to this particular place. So I
Yeah.
like that there's no easy answers.
Yeah, there needs to be like this like trans framing, you know, needs to be taken into account as well. No pun intended, but like, you know, like, yeah,
Mhm.
like, you know, okay, so within this society, given as it is, you know, boys here, girls here, a few people who, you know, got their neurology opposite from their body or whatever, the rest
Mhm.
of their body, but like,
Mhm.
and then maybe a whole bunch of people are mistaken about what category they should be in. But then
Mhm.
in a different society, that would be partition could be partitioned totally differently. You know what I mean? So, and then those people would be right, except they would be in a, like the definitions of gender would be different,
Mhm.
and or they would be a entirely different category potentially. Like we don't know, you know, and it's like, but if it's coming, if there's a lot of people suffering from negative stereotypes of, you know, being a certain gender and like trauma and abuse and not wanting to identify with who they are, then that I don't want to like dismiss that either. Like that's
Right.
something that makes me, the whole point of being trans is to like really like step into yourself as a whole and not to disavow an entire part of who you are.
Mhm.
Me, you know, and I feel like there's definitely potential. I know some of my clients say this, so I don't feel like I'm, you know, just giving kind of a, you know, anti woke viewpoint on this or something, but like that, like there's a possible misstep that you could like totally do the thing that you're trying to avoid doing, you know.
Mhm. Mhm. Hmm.
I know it's like so much. I've been thinking about this for like upwards of 2 years now, Taylor. Like,
Yeah. 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 And there was something in there that there's something in there you said that had me make right. So you were talking about sort of the cultural differences. You know, I imagine you know some specific ones, but you know, hypothetically, the idea that all cultures are going to have different relationships to things. It's the whole thing that makes one culture distinct from another culture is there are differences. Um, but I wonder about sort of your thought of the general, not narrative, what's the right word? The general framing that tends to be out there around what we'll call culture war issues to me seems to be massively American centric.
that's yeah.
And it's not specific even to trans. Certainly, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine you also see it on the racism side of things,
Mm-hmm.
because generally, when you look out to the news media, or you look out to, you know, other people on, you know, say YouTube or whatever, who aren't from the US, they relate to these cultural war issues. They tend, or at least in my experience, they tend to relate to them a little bit differently. And in fact, some of them are just like, what are you guys all going on about? Like, this is not the way things are here. Or we don't hold this particular perspective. And they start to get sort of agitated and annoyed about how American centric and how just loud the American bullhorn is around these things, that it starts as this gravitational suck that I feel a lot being in Canada, that we just get sucked into the American conversation. I mean, to whatever degree it's a conversation. Uh,
Yeah.
I wonder, does that fit for you? Do you perceive it that way?
I mean, I've kind of background knowledge. Like, I mean, I'm part of the bullhorn, so you know, I don't hear any of you guys, but whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
but like it scares me a little bit to know that I live this country, and that the fact that we're exporting our understandings of things and our issues to the world is really freaky to me, because I feel like we are insane. Like it just, it makes sense though. I was talking with someone on a Discord about Kendrick Lamar, and it was like only like it was two of us from America, just like, oh, this is the most important album right now. This is such a huge thing. It's like really speaking to like the soul of the zeitgeist or whatever in the shadow that we're experiencing. And then like I think it was just and then other people, I don't know if it's because they weren't from the US, but like just were kind of like they didn't participate in that whole chunk of the dialogue.
Yeah.
And I was like, there's nothing comparable, like they don't see why this is such a thing for us. But then Kendrick's #1 on YouTube right now, so that's going out worldwide.
Sure. And I mean, he's been pretty popular, in general anyways. So I don't think that's just new to his current album.
No, for sure. It's
Seen it.
definitely like, it's talking about like the grief of American Black culture, the grief of American culture, the inability to talk to each other and stuff on, it's getting more deep into those things. And I don't know if it's going to apply to everybody very well or not.
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't. I've listened to one song off that album. I haven't dug into the whole thing yet, but I eventually will. So I think there was a couple of the things that I kind of wanted to pick your brain about, or sort of check in with, sort of before we close, or see whether or not there's anything that's there for you. I wonder. This is maybe for both of us, but probably more for you on trans issues, because I tend not to go seeking too much in that particular area. Other cultural war issues I do. So, in terms of racism, I tend to watch like Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter or Coleman Hughes, or people like that who are on YouTube who have a particular, in some ways it's a very confirming perspective, but I've also listened to, people who've been on the other side as well. So I tend to put more of my attention there. But I wonder who you sort of see, or who you perceive as having the conversation around gender or around trans issues, and who are doing it well. Like, is there anybody that you sort of perceive who's really doing that? Or is it just... Yeah.
I'm so pissed right now, to be honest. Like we're frustrated, and just like, I don't know. I feel arrogant saying this, but like, John and Greg Enriquez, and to a little bit Agnes Keller, like we're really confirming for me, like directly on that I'm onto something with the way I'm thinking about this. And I don't see that anywhere. Hardly at all. A couple scientists have some really interesting stuff to say about, biology and all that. And
they're bold enough and not willing to lose their job.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they've got tenure, and they can talk about, like Robert Sapolsky would be one. He's very, and like, a few primatologists talking about gender, like, transgender primate, members of primate pods who, we can't call them transgender because that's a cultural construct in a sense, but they behave in the same way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like, and so like we see that kind of stuff. It's interesting, really interesting from science. Science is, I think, way more interesting than in culture right now when it comes to trans issues and gender and all that stuff, because it's like I feel I wish I could. I feel like I'm being a jerk, and there's probably like a lot of people who are saying really cool things. I feel like Natalie Wynn had some interesting stuff to say. She's she comes from a leftist perspective on a lot of stuff. And she's been on the STOA with like Noam Chomsky, which is an interesting.
Okay. I knew that name. Yes, I remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah, she had some stuff that was cool about like, I don't identify as always having been a woman. I was a man, now I'm a woman. And like, because like socially you look at me and you see a woman, whereas before you would see a man. And so she had a really different, like, it was refreshing to hear someone like going against the current for me. You don't have to just like adhere to this like dogma of I was just this one thing all along, and don't even use my anything from the past. But so she was really cool. And I'm looking for those people, to be honest. I really want to find it, but I feel like I'm running solo out here in a weird way, and it's kind of like, no, there are a few people in the sense making scene who are also trans, I would say, who are, where we're kind of like collectively looking at some of this stuff. And I don't want to say who they are, but they just really, really helpful, like smart people who are like doing what we're doing. And we're able to kind of bat this stuff around in a more free way and not being afraid of looking at things multi-perspectively, especially and
Yeah.
testing out different ideas.
Yeah, but I'm also hearing in terms of like putting something out there for sort of the public or that framing, there's not much. Or at least you haven't been tipped off to too much of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I could be clueless. I live under a rock anyway, so like it's just, yeah, I don't know. John told me that I was gonna have a hard time and I was gonna have to repeat myself infinitely many times, basically, because I was just trying to steer this third course, and I don't know why. There's got to be other people. Sorry, that's my answer.
Yeah, no, and I wonder if it's your work to do.
Like it's on me. That's sort of why, like it's not a bad thing. It's just it's a thing that I've sensed, like I feel the weight of trying to take this up and do my best to emulate Socrates in this one way, on this one issue at least.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to name something. I have no idea if the power went out here. I'm present, but
okay, I was kind of rambling because I was sort of just bitching about feeling sort of on my own with it, to be honest,
Yeah, and I've had the sense that maybe that's a bit of sort of the struggle that you were sort of speaking to in naming, is just like, I've got a perspective. I'm pretty sure I've got a good grip on this perspective, and it's like feels super scary to turn and actually like stand for against the tidal wave of, let's say, the thesis position.
Yeah, I've got like what I perceive as kind of like wokeness, or I don't know, wokeness is getting so tired, but trans queer community people, and then other people from other perspectives, and I feel like I'm trying to like in the terms of like standing in the tide, like on a rock, like keeping my balance somehow, and also moving forward. Yeah, like anyone who's dealing, I mean, I'm sure I know anyone who's dealing like with their own community and struggling against the common view, especially in this cultural climate, it's hard, I mean, as I don't know if that's why certain people just don't speak up, or if they do speak up and get smacked down, they like have a lot of problems from that. But
so maybe two final questions. One is, what do you think, because I think there's a lot of agreement, a lot of alignment with sort of the way that we're perceiving things. I wonder what we might think we might be missing in sort of holding this position, this perspective. Is there something that we're devaluing or dismissing? So I wonder about that. I wonder if anything comes to you.
Yeah. Should I go on that one?
Sure. Yeah.
That one for sure. I think the so-called TERF perspective is getting ignored, but in this conversation, and there is validity there. I think in terms of like the feelings of being sort of invaded or whatever. Can't speak to it. I have my own bias, and it's hard. That's a really hard one. I want to talk to more people, hopefully, about that, but come from that world when I can stomach it enough, at least at those times. And
that's totally opens up a whole number of things I want to ask you about. I mean, what would I say? I would say sort of my headline is, the way that I interpret it, and again, I'm not that embroiled in it, but the way that I interpret it, the position, if I could steelman it, is I think this goes back a bit to sort of, what we were talking about before historically, and sort of the oppression, and then the over reactivity that comes in a response to it. But to me, I sort of imagine, women, or at least women who are holding this position, sort of feel like we're just getting there. We just got there. And now this other, complication is being sort of laid at our feet, and we're being told to just wholesale, welcome this and take this on. And and I imagine they feel like they're losing something. They're losing some part of their identity, because they're basically, I think what they're hearing and the way they're perceiving it is that they're supposed to disidentify with the things that they think make them female or make them women,
Yeah. Yeah.
in order to have other people feel included. And it's just like, Jesus, like we just sort of got here. I don't know if that jives for you,
No,
but that's
totally jives. It's like, we fucking menstruate every month and we have to give birth and we have to get shit on, in terms of our income. You know what I mean? Like that, I've had these great conversations with this woman, Adriana Forte-Nally, who's like this kind of somatic shaman. And she has this kind of view of femininity in the menstrual cycle and how we're not taking that into enough consideration in terms of our mentality. This is a really bad broad brushing version of her ideas, but we've had these great convos about like re-inhabiting womanhood and like from these different perspectives, but that don't seem to work on paper, because like a lot of people are like, yeah, like this is my history. You don't have any of this. You never, bled, on the regular basis, and we're shamed for it. And, Adriana's view is the shame factors in majorly in that too. Like the anger comes from that, like, I've been told this is bad and I'm fighting, fighting to identify with this thing. And now you're taking that away from me. So
sounds
yeah.
like it's not fair sort of thing is sort of the tone that I get. Yeah.
Just to waltz in here and claim this label and,
Mm-hmm.
I've got my counter arguments or whatever I don't want to get into really, but
It could be a whole other discussion.
yeah, like, oh, who's suffering the most,
That's a slippery slope too to start into that, right?
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then we got to have the biological and gender. We got to have sex. We got to talk about sex and gender. Like that's, it's a fair point to make. That's like, how could you have gender without sex? Like it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I imagine then it leads into more complicated ideas, after menopause. Then it's like, well, you're not doing that anymore. Well, but I went through the experience of doing it, and in terms
like these are my little, snappy counterpoints. Like, oh well, what if it's, a cis girl never did bleed because she didn't have a uterus for some reason or had to get it removed, and now she's not a woman either. Is that what you're saying? But you know what I mean? There can get real punchy stuff pretty quickly.
Yeah. There's always an angle that will allow us to sort of reinforce our position, stay behind our wall. There's something about all that. I just wanted to take a look in sort of my notes to sort of see. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly other things that I would have liked to have sort of checked in with you about. Certainly that idea of especially when it comes to children, and sort of that idea of like, oh, I feel like I'm a woman, or I feel like I'm a boy, and it's like, well, oh, how do you know that, and it sort of raises those questions for me about, as you were sort of talking about the 5% of the brain, that's gendered, and I wonder, like, because I don't actually know. I'm aware that it's a small amount and there's the overlap, but I don't really have any details. But then I start to wonder, like, oh, is that based on development of, having particular hormones in one system at an elevated rate? And then it leads me to a question mark. As far as I know, although I could be wrong, I don't imagine that male to female transitioning women take progesterone. Is that true?
I do personally.
Okay. So, okay.
Second phase puberty kind of thing.
Okay. So is that more common now, or?
I think it is. Like they're realizing like, oh, you just can't throw. I mean, what we were taking at first was just like a, cheap version of whatever, we would get like, oh, this caused men to grow boobs, so then we'll just give trans women this, substance, just like we're guessing. I mean, yeah, we are a small fraction of the population, so it's not necessarily, that's one of those things where it's not necessarily wrong that there's not a ton of attention,
right,
paid sign, or hasn't been, in the past, but it's just how it is. And so yeah, I'm doing more of that now. I'm cycling progesterone as like more of a trying to like emulate more of a monthly, and actually it works better. Like my brain likes to go on it and off of it.
Yeah.
Like the reason I started it was I couldn't sleep if I stayed on it too long, 11 or 12 days in, and it's like, nope, now you need this break. So
yeah, I mean, why I'm glad to hear that. Which seems like a really weird thing to say, but my wife is on So she's postmenopausal. She had perimenopause. So she's on hormone replacement therapy. And yeah, there's that cycle of being on like a rigid amount day to day, and like how that changes her cognition, brain fog, sleep capacity, stuff like that. It's like, oh, that starts to sound more and more like that, that thing that you're saying that, some women are sort of arguing against, the turfs or whatever. It's like, oh, well, you didn't do this. It's like, well, we're getting pretty damn close to,
Yeah.
to the full blown experience. I think that's the last question I wanted to ask that's sort of connected to that is, have you noticed through your transition, like changes in your cognition?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think it's an obvious answer, but it's one that I don't hear people talk about that much.
Yeah, no, it's such a good question. These are all just great questions, by the way. I love this whole thing. Because it's like just a space to talk. But for me, like the greatest thing about hormones was cognitive shifts, or at least emotional, cognitive change. Yeah, like I don't think my spatial reasoning shifted downward and my verbal reasoning shifted upward or anything like that significantly. Like maybe a little bit. I was already like if this findings of science so far to be believed, like my brain was basically a woman's brain when I was, after third trimester. So that's kind of a given. So I thought how I thought, minus all the cultural stuff. And then but I feel the sense of anger has just gone way, way down in me. Like after about a few months on hormones, it just and it changed. Like I get more irritated. Like, you can tell, like, this is why I've compared to John's video, I'm swearing a ton more because I'm just like, you know what, fuck it. I'm just going to be myself. And I get irritated, but I don't have these like surging anger. Like I used to hit objects on a regular basis, and maybe that was because I didn't fit in the world, or maybe I think it was partly both, but, and I don't have like surges of energy in a positive sense the same way either. I need to pace myself. I need to be more, like, okay, I'm not going to have the stamina to just push through this last minute thing. I need to prepare for it a little better, Like that's real to me. Like it's, and that's where I think maybe the cognitive differences are more significant, in the hormone, when you're under the influence of these hormones for a while. Not to say that like, someone who never takes hormones isn't a valid trans person or whatever. Like it's to say, I don't even know what to be honest, I don't know what category we should end up in down the road. Like, should we be like, should there be two, or should there be, other categories of people? That's a whole different question. I wanted to add that in though, because it's still, that's open to me,
Yeah.
But something about taking the hormones and getting the shift of like, oh, like I'm like, smell and color are more enhanced and vivid, and like pain is more pronounced for sure. Like it just, everything's hurt more, things feel better, sex feels better. Like it's just like there are just differences that like sensory differences that are huge, which you could relate to like maybe evolutionary reasons for that. But like a lot of stuff I didn't expect a lot. Like I like Christmas lights now, and I used to think they were just these boring things, and now I'm like, oh, that's so pretty, it's like purple and white, and like just the smell of lilacs. I know guys appreciate this stuff too, but like
yeah.
Like it just hits me so much harder, just like just pure perception is like so strong now in some ways. That was really cool to me. I just like, despite the pain and stuff, it's like validating.
Right. Yeah. I guess nothing's free, right? So it's like you get all this, but you get it. I'm sort of curious, just more, not to go deep into it, but I'm curious, before you transitioned, did you have high or low testosterone? Because you were saying noticed that you were really angry, but I wondered if you ever had that sort of looked at or measured, or.
Yeah, we checked it going in, and it was like in the standard range. I think it was actually toward the lower end of that range, because I remember being like sort of proud of that fact, which is ridiculous, but it's like, oh yeah, this validate, like my body is more feminine to begin with, and then
Sure.
But I just, I think a lot of this, I do think that's why it's partly cultural, that I just like inherited from like my family. Just like when a guy has an emotion, it's a temper thing and you just lose your shit, that's like what you should do.
Yeah.
But the fact that it took so long to, like, it took months and then suddenly I wasn't doing that anymore. Once I started taking estrogen initially,
Mhm.
2 months later, that started to change. And it wasn't like I didn't identify differently at that point, or you know what I mean? It didn't
Mhm.
correlate to any like shift in my behavior as far as dressing differently suddenly or anything like that. It was just like, oh, I just don't have that anymore.
Mhm.
I feel like there's something hormonally chemical there too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it just made the parallel of you saying like, oh, lower end of the normal range. It's like, yeah, that's where mine's at right now. Because
Yeah.
there's also that part. It's like, yeah, hormones are part of this, but they're also not the whole story. Is
Yeah,
kind of what I'm
definitely.
left with.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And me and Adriana 14 Alley talk about that a lot because she's talking about the menstrual cycle, but in terms of like the mentality of the menstrual cycle, and
Mhm.
sense of grief and loss and like rebuilding and
Mhm.
total like, sexual power at the height of it as well, the
Yeah.
summer and winter. And I'm like, yeah, like most trans women don't have that particular hormonal cycle going in their brains, so that's a difference. It's like it's there, like when a trans woman takes, like when they take a shot, which I don't, I do patches, but like when they get a big shot of estrogen, like they go through like a mini like PMS sometimes,
Mhm.
like there's this, so there is like a cycle or just different versions of it, but you would think that would have some effect on cognition and just how you view the world, over time, if that just kept happening to you in that way, or
Yeah.
didn't happen to you.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like that is your experience. Things do occur to you a little bit differently than they did as you and I imagine that will just continue to build and build and build throughout
Yeah.
your lifetime. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like I'm opening myself to that over time. Like what is my actual experience here? And,
Mhm.
who am I based on that? Takes some time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I yeah, I gotta go. I don't want to, but yeah,
Fantastic.
need to take my daughter to soccer or
Mm,
volleyball. Yeah. Um, yeah,
cool.
I don't really know how to end this other than just thank you. Um, there's like a way in which it's like, yes, we touched on some things, and then there's also like a feeling of incompleteness. Like there's so much potentially more here as well. But I just really appreciate yeah, just sharing this time with you and sort of dancing around and seeing what's sort of here for us as we sort of look at this thing or these things, how we're relating to them and how they're showing up in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely the same. Just I think that's becoming the mark of like dialogos to me. One of them is that there's always so much more by the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And now we're right back to this is so exhausting to figure out.
Totally. But I feel invigorated in this
Yes.
case.
Yes.
Personally, I don't know, but I feel like there's so much more, and it's like the wonder instead of the, that like curiosity closed case kind of thing. It's like, no, we can, maybe that's part of the solution to what you're saying. I think it's a really important thing to bring up the exhaustion, but that
Mhm.
as a conversations can be combinatorial explosive in a positive way.
Yeah. Well, and now it's more like the hermeneutics of beauty, right? Like,
Yeah.
or like,
Yes.
I feel like I have a slightly more expanded perspective. I
Mm,
know a little bit more about you, know a little bit more about how you think, but it's also connected to, my framing and sort of grip on some of these things. So I
yeah.
just feel really appreciative. It felt generative and very novel in many ways, and also very affirming in many ways too. So it's also nice to have
Mm,
perspectives sort of affirmed and like, okay, I'm not alone, and Rachel agrees with me, and that's
yeah.
great. And yeah,
Yeah, we can cross these identity lines,
totally.
talk and have a picnic in the hill between them or whatever, and it's fine. And yeah, then also it's just cool. I have a lot of the same experience, to be honest. Like that, I could talk to like a cis dude who, and have these commonalities, which I find more and more over time, of course,
Mhm.
hopefully, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is definitely a special instance of that for me to have this time. I really value it.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks so much. And good luck with your talk. I look forward to watching it with John.
Yeah, thank you. I'm
I
excited.
imagine you'll go into some very good nitty gritty places that'll just further expand my grip on reality around this.
Yeah, same here. It was kind of a like me like reaching out, like, please help me like figure out gender more to John. So that's what I'm hoping we'll do.
Beautiful.